have been released this morning that reveal the number of children classed as living in relative poverty is at its lowest level since the 1980s. That number, according to the Department for Work and Pensions, stands at 2.3 million, covering the period between April 2013 and March 2014. Well, with me now are Alison Garnham from the Child Poverty Action Group and Adam Memon, Head of Economic Research at the Centre for Policy Studies, and welcome to you both. First of all, are you surprised by these figures? Because the Institute of Fiscal Studies, Alison, had suggested that actually, by the current definition, the number of children living in relative poverty would be going up.
Yes, it is slightly surprising that we haven't seen that change yet, but we still expect to see it because there are so many cuts to tax credits and benefits in the pipeline that these will show up in the figures eventually. But of course, the other news is that the numbers have flatlined, so there's been no improvement either. So the worry, therefore, is that we're not actually making any progress towards reducing child poverty. So that means we're way off achieving the goal of ending child poverty by 2020.
Yes, Adam, I mean, do you accept that although the figures have flatlined, there isn't anything particularly good in terms of the news that we're seeing today in these figures?
Well, clearly it's too high. It's 2.3 million is children living in relative poverty is still too high. But actually, it's the lowest number since the 1980s. There have been some improvements over recent decades. This measure is not perfect. It doesn't show an absolute measurement of deprivations in certain areas. But look at workless households, look at employment rates, look at wages. These are all things which are improving. But
the average income isn't going up, is it? That's why we're seeing these figures flatlining, because relative to the average income, basically, children apparently aren't any worse off. But Alison,
right,
do you believe that they actually are?
To a certain extent, what it's showing is that everyone's not doing very well. And so the people at the bottom are also not doing very well. But we do know from our work with children and families that families are struggling. We know homelessness is increasing. We know more people are going to food banks. People are really struggling to put food on the table. Kids are arriving at school without having eaten. So we know that there is a problem on the ground already, and it just hasn't been picked up in the figures yet. But the measures that we have in the Child Poverty Act, there's actually 4 of them. So the one that you just referred to about absolute poverty is actually there. And if you look at that figure after housing costs, child poverty has increased by about 500,000 since 2010. So that's the trend. We know real incomes are falling, and it just doesn't show up.
Adam, you want to come in?
So that's not quite true, because the figures that which have been published today, it's quite important to remember, those are to the year 2013-14.
Right.
Now, in the year after that, we've seen wages grow 2.7%. So, basically in real terms, so real incomes are now beginning to rise quite substantially. If you look at, say, for example, the number of children in workless households, so in 2010, that was about 1.9 million, and that's fallen now to about 1.53 million. So that's still too high, but about 400,000 fewer children in workless households is good progress.
But perhaps the real story coming out of this today is looking ahead to that government ambition of eradicating child poverty by 2020. I mean, based on what we're seeing here today with this flatlining of figures, based on this measure, and that is disputed, that's another story in itself, is the government going to be in a really tough place to try to reach that target?
Oh, of course it'll be difficult, but the most important way, the most powerful way you can eradicate poverty as far as you can is to have more jobs and higher wages and reform education to expand skills. And broadly, that's what we've seen over the last few years, and I think the government is quite committed to doing that. There certainly needs to be doing a lot more to have further progress.
Alison?
I mean, that's right, there's progress on wages starting now, but the problem is that's not being shared by the people at the bottom, who've seen massive cuts, 22 billion cuts in benefits and tax credits. We also know, I mean, the importance of jobs is absolutely crucial, but we know that 2/3 of poor children live with a working parent. So their low wages and their high housing costs and high childcare costs are contributing to them being in poverty. So, we expect to see more evidence of that in future.
What do you think is the solution then? You say, yes, of course, the best way to help people out of poverty is to get them into work, but you're concerned about the rate of welfare cuts, and we know that there are 12 billion of them coming in this Parliament. Yeah. I mean, what are your thoughts on what might happen between now and 2020? Do you think we are going to see a gradual reduction in that number of children in poverty, or are you concerned that it might go up again?
I'm concerned that we're going to see a child poverty crisis. These figures are going to be an underestimate in any case, because there are 12 billion more cuts to come. So the position is going to change and get worse for children and families.
Adam, what do you think the government needs to focus on between now and then to actually make this figure budge? Because clearly, it hasn't gone down, but, that's not good enough, is it?
Well, what the government has to do is improve the material well-being of people, the poorest people in our country, and they can do that by improving productivity and bearing down on the cost of living. And there are a number of ways they can do that, through skills, regulation reform, infrastructure, boosting investment, all of these things which the government should be focusing on in the budget and autumn statement, but also in the cost of living as well. We know that people on the poorest income suffer greatly, the most in fact, from inflation. So bearing down on things like childcare costs, housing costs, will be all critical in the next few months and years.
OK, Adam Memon from the Centre for Policy Studies, Alison Garnham from the Child Poverty Action Group. Thank you both very much for your time this morning.